Hey there, fiber friends. Sarah here, and let's talk about some spinning. So I haven't actually had my spinning wheel out and functional in over a year now. I think part of that is having a small toddler, part of that is a very busy family life, and part of that is the quilting bug that I've caught in the last year, which has sort of stolen a lot of my fiber crafting energy into quilting. But I was watching Andrea Mowry's latest I'll Knit and Spin If I Want To, and she is hosting a spin and knit along to do a sock spin. So I've never spun a sock yarn, and I've never knit socks with hand spun yarn. So may as well hop in. If you feel the fire to get back to spinning, you should take it and run with it, right? So I went diving through my stash and I found this bump here of what I'm fairly certain is a BFL nylon blend. I know that I had a large bag of this fiber, and the year that our basement flooded, I went ahead and used all of my dyes that I had mixed up to dye that bag of fiber, because I didn't want to be putting jars of already made up dye into storage. I was pregnant with Marshall at the time. I knew that I probably wouldn't be doing any dyeing for at least a year, so why not use up all of the dye stock that I had on hand? And so I dyed those braids just by pouring whatever dyes I had on hand onto fiber. You can see that the color is really quite concentrated. This one here has some browns and some reds and some really great teals and greens, a little bit of yellows and golds, and so it should make a really pretty autumnal sock yarn. So what I need to do now, before I can dive into the fiber, is get my wheel back into shape. On my flyer I have a bobbin on which I had started to spin some singles. This would have been, pardon the crinkling. These singles would be from this braid here. This is a wool fiend braid of merino mulberry silk baby camel. So a beautiful blend, and it looks like the fibers were dyed first and then blended. The colorway was called Seashore, and I have 4.3 ounces of it. So you can see what I was spinning from when I didn't finish this bobbin. So I'm going to set this one aside. Hopefully I won't need to wind this off. I think I've got enough other bobbins available. And pop an empty bobbin on. And I'm going to need to oil my flyer. I find that putting some oil on sort of the spindle that goes down the middle of the bobbin helps to keep things from being too squeaky. Sorry, I'm nitpicking right now. I noticed that I've got some fiber sort of stuck in the join between the metal and wooden part here. But yeah, so new bobbin on my flyer, put the whorl back on, pop this up into my wheel, and like I said, I'll give everything a good oiling. But you'll notice that I don't have a drive band on and I don't have a brake band on. Alex and Dom and Marshall as well are notorious for wanting to touch my spinning wheel, play with my spinning wheel, get into trouble with my spinning wheel. And the thing that tends to get ruined the fastest with children and spinning wheels is your brake band, because little springs can get pulled out of shape, and yeah, it just ends up being a mess. This isn't even the spring that came with it. That was a replacement spring I had already used. But I went ahead and ordered a couple sets of replacement brake bands from an Ashford dealer, someone on Etsy, don't really remember who. They're inexpensive to buy the replacement sets. Typically it'll be the shipping that'll cost the most, so I recommend buying a couple at once. It's basically just some, I think, nylon cord and a pair of these springs. So if you can't find someone selling Ashford specific or your wheel specific brake band sets, you can do like I've done and go shopping around at the hardware store for springs that have a similar sort of springiness, if that makes sense. These are fairly cheap. I think they're like less than $1 each when you look at the hardware store. And you may need to try trial and error until you get ones that end up working with your wheel. I know that I tried 3 or 4. This one here is actually from a longer spring that I cut and then just made a new loop here. So anyways, springs, 2 springs, new brake band. Get you looking right at my mother and my flyer here. So you have sort of a tension key that has a wee little hole in it, and some of your brake band is going to get tied off there. Then you have like an eye here and one on the opposite side, and your springs are going to go 1 spring between your tension knob and this eye, and the second spring is going to, so I'm doing a terrible job explaining this. Let me see. I'm gonna go ahead and grab some scissors and cut this so you can just watch me set this up. How's that sound? All right, I'm back now. So I've cut my band into 2 lengths, about 2/3 and 1/3. So I'm going to take the smaller piece, grab my tension knob here, thread it through, and tie it off, and knot it a couple times because you don't want that just coming loose. If I was smart, I would have a pair of pliers or something here so I could grip it better and pull. But because I didn't go ahead and get those in advance, I'm going to end up just using my teeth. So, real simple, just tied off on your tension key. That goes in here. Next up is we want a spring in this location. You want to give yourself a couple wraps worth of band around here before you attach your spring, because you want to be able to adjust your tension, and that's how you're going to do that. Then spring just gets tied on to this end. And like I said, you can always twist more wraps around that tension knob or less to find sort of the sweet spot. So just real simple. Knot, pull it tight with not your teeth, because you'll break your teeth eventually. So that's going to go here. Then we're going to tie the other piece of the brake band to the other end of this spring, just double knotting it, pulling it tight. So I've got my tension knob, spring, string, and now you're going to want to test drive this. So I'm going to twist my tension knob until my spring is sitting sort of right here in the middle between this eye and my tension knob, loop the drive band or brake band up and over my bobbin. I need to tie my other spring on to this side, and this is where this is going to be where it's more important to get the length, because the spring is just going to hook onto this other eye hook. Oh my gosh, if any of this is making sense to you, give this video a like. Clearly it's been a while since I've had to think about talking to a camera. Probably if I took the time to go back and watch the original assembly video for my Ashford Kiwi, and I do have that video still on this channel, there's probably a measurement that those instructions gave me to cut this second length of band to fit perfectly. But what I'm going to do is just put it on and sort of eyeball where that knot needs to be on this side of my whorl. And then go ahead and tie it onto the second spring. Up and over, hook it on, and I think we should be pretty good. So you've got 2 springs here. You could cut your extra bits of brake band off if you like, probably a little after, but brake band on. Now drive band. My wheel came with a plasticky, don't know what the actual material is off the top of my head. It's got a little bit of stretch to it, drive band. You can use a leather sort of strip with just a knot tied in it. Some people will use a cotton thread, not thread. Some people will use like a cotton string but most commonly you see these sort of rubbery drive bands. They do over time, especially if you're not militant about taking them off the wheel when you're not using them, which I am not. I leave mine on. In fact, I actually do a worse thing. When I'm not using it, I park my wheel by taking my drive band off the whorl and popping it to sort of rest up here so that the whorl can spin freely, which will just, you know, it's a little bit more stretched than the smallest whorl here, and it ends up stretching things out. So they do over time stretch out, and as they become slack, they tend to skip. Your wheel isn't just going to perform as well as it used to. So you can go ahead and order new ones if you like, and I did that. However, there are two different sizes, and I was shipped the larger size. So this is one that I was shipped, and I'll show you what I mean, around my wheel, and you can see it's just much, much too large. So what you can do is, because I didn't want, the shipping took forever, I didn't want to have to, at the time, send it back and wait for new ones. And what you can do, and what I could have done with my old one, is cut it yourself, heat it in a candle, in a flame, and shove the two ends back together. So this is the other too long one that I trimmed to fit my wheel better. And you can see that it's just snug. And I've done some spinning with that join and haven't had it pop spontaneously. And I figure I've got one more that's too long. I've got my original stretched out one, so I've got enough drive band that I can sort of melt splice to my heart's content, should that splice fail. So apart from oiling, which I'll do after, my wheel should be ready to go. And like I said, for oiling, I usually put a little bit sort of on these metal parts that rub. The squeaking usually is coming from my flyer and my bobbin moving around relative to each other. Some people do oil down where the main wheel, sort of the pin that's on. You can also put some oil on the treadle apparatus as well. You're supposed to use spinning wheel oil that you buy. I have never purchased it or owned any, so I quite honestly use a little bit of olive oil. So celebrate my Italian heritage by olive oiling my spinning wheel. Wheel's kind of set up. Now the next thing I need to think about in order to do this spin to knit along is how I'm going to prepare my fiber. Fairly certain that this is a BFL nylon blend, probably somewhere in the range of 75% wool, 25% nylon, 80% wool, 20% nylon. I don't have that information anymore. I know at the time that I dyed this, I also dyed some regular merino fiber. However, what has me convinced that this one is one of the BFL ones is that before I dyed it, when the fiber was in its sort of factory state, the individual fibers were really very smooth and lying nice and straight. After dyeing, you can see that there's a lot of fuzziness and crimp. And BFL is a long wool, and it doesn't have a very fine crimp like a merino would. It has sort of a wave to it. And in some places, much like how if you have naturally curly hair, you can straighten it with an iron, but when you get it wet, it's going to come back to that curl. So much like that, although when I first received this fiber, there was no wave. It was nice and perfectly straight from the process that it goes through at the factory that it came from. Once I dyed it, got it wet and let it dry again, you can start to see some of that natural wave back in the fiber here. And if you spread it out more, you can see a bit more of that. So more of this wave and less of a real springy crimp that I would associate with merino. So fairly, 90% to 100% certain that this is in fact the BFL nylon blend, which would be an excellent sock yarn. So unlike merino, which as much as we love to knit wool socks with beautifully hand-dyed merino sock yarns, it's actually a terrible fiber for socks because it's a short staple, it's very fine, it's very likely to have those fibers escape from the twist of the yarn through wear and tear in your socks and wear through quickly. Blueface Leicester, BFL, on the other hand, is a long staple yarn. Blueface Leicester, BFL, on the other hand, is a long staple fiber. So those fiber lengths, rather than being in the 1.5 to 2 inch range, can be up to like 7. I've got a fleece, a BFL fleece, I think we're like in the 10-inch range for some of the locks. So really nice and long. Higher micron count, which means the fibers themselves are a bit thicker, still small enough to be soft. A lot of the long wools, the micron count goes up quite large, and they're not likely to be as soft. BFL is sort of this beautiful balance between a long staple length and yet still a smaller micron count for great softness. But those two things, that long staple and the fact that the fibers aren't quite as fine, mean that in your sock yarn, that long staple is going to have more twists on that individual fiber. It's going to be less likely to work its way out of the sock yarn. And that slightly thicker fiber is going to be less likely to break in the abrasion of being worn as socks. So BFL, amazing, amazing natural sock yarn. This happens to have some nylon content in it. Nylon is going to both dye a bit better than the BFL, than the wool. If you've ever dyed pure nylon, you'll see that it just sucks color into it. The other reason that the nylon is helpful in a sock yarn, being a synthetic fiber, it's extruded during its chemical production process, and the length of the fibers is basically as long as you want them to be. And so again, nice long fiber length, you're going to have more twists, more wrapping around that yarn when you spin. Less likely that the nylon fibers are going to work their way out. In fact, when you use a wool nylon sock yarn to knit your socks, you'll notice that as the wool escapes from the yarn, sometimes what's left is just that 25% nylon twist in the thin spots. So all of the wool will have escaped and just the nylon remains. So anyways, basically an amazing fiber for a sock spin. So I have my fiber chosen. Like I said, I dyed it myself, just sort of randomly dumping whatever dyes I had on hand at the time onto the fiber. It's dyed in a way that I would say doesn't have any distinct repeating patterns. And the sections of color, some longer sections, but a lot of fairly short sections of color. So what I have to decide on now is, how do I want to prepare this braid for spinning? A sock yarn traditionally should be a 3-ply. Now there are 2 ways you can go about doing a 3-ply. One would be to separate this fiber into 3, spin 3 singles and do a traditional 3-ply. The second would be to do a chain ply, which is going to sort of artificially take 1 ply and make it into a 3-ply. So you do like a crocheting chain motion and you end up with a 3-ply yarn. The nice thing about a chain ply is that it will preserve whatever color order your singles are. But on the other hand, you do get these little bumps occasionally where the chain sort of pulls through. I'm not certain how well that makes sense. I'll link to a video where I've done some chain plying before in the description below. You may also see this technique called Navajo plying. However, while a Navajo ply is a type of chain ply, sort of the more appropriate term, unless you're following the exact traditions that the Navajo spinners do, the more appropriate term would be a chain ply for what I'm just sort of flying off the seat of my pants doing here on YouTube. So, like I said, I need to decide on how I want to spin this. I think I'm going to go with a traditional 3-ply, which means dividing this fiber up in 3. Now, I need to fight my natural inclination to want my socks to be identical twins and not sisters. If you've seen any of the socks that I ever post over on Instagram, if I'm doing self-patterning, self-striping sock yarn, I do everything I can every time to make sure that my socks are twins and not just sisters. It drives me banana sandwich, the idea that I would have self-patterning sock yarn and not have all of my stripes and color changes match up perfectly. I think that regardless, I need to shake that and know that this is going to be sort of a variegated, mottled enough yarn that I don't need to worry about that. So what I then need to decide is, do I want to split my fiber? Well, there's different ways, right? So first, I could spin this whole braid as it comes to me this way and just work my way through the full thickness of the braid. And then when I filled up, when I've used 1/3 of it, put that bobbin aside, keep going, spin the next third, put that bobbin aside, keep going, spin the last third, put that bobbin aside. And so what I would get would be this color procession in my single. And then when I ply, it would be as if I folded this sort of on itself, and the ply would be plying these sort of full sections against each other. If that makes sense. What I would get there would be longer color sections. So when I get into this teal, if I have the full width of my braid spinning at once, I'll get a longer section of this teal that will ply against maybe a longer section of this red and a longer section of this dark brown. Could be very interesting. Alternatively, I could split my braid. So I could try my best to divide my braid into thirds this way, pull them, and I would get the same order of colors. They would be shorter color segments because I have less of this teal in each one. But when I go to ply them, I would be plying all 3 of these teals together. And so I would get a more distinct sock yarn. There'd be less optical blending of the colors. I would have a section of teal, a section of the brown, a section of the sort of dark brown, a section of this red. They're not going to line up perfectly because the imprecise nature of splitting this fiber, along with the imprecise nature of spinning itself, like as much as we try and spin the most even, consistent yarn possible, there's always going to be thicker and thinner sections. So, could split it this way. I could split it this way, and I could invert one of these braids so that when I go to ply, I'd have 2 coming off of this end, and if I could find my other end of the fiber, and then I would have one segment running in the opposite direction, which would line some different colors up and again make a more mottled or variegated yarn. Lots of options, lots of choices. You could dive even further and do fractal yarns, which I won't go into here because I think to do a 3-ply, I'd end up splitting down too far, and we're not probably going to do a fractal 3-ply here. I'm not probably going to do a fractal 3-ply. You could discard the braid in its original form altogether, and you could pull out and separate all of the green into a pile, all of the red into a pile, all of the brown into a pile, and then sort of have a marled yarn. I could take it over to my drum carder and really change this into a bat and sort of mix and blend the colors that way. So there's lots of choices. And I'm going to percolate on that for a minute and come back to you, let you know how I plan to spin this fiber. All right, so what I've done is I've split my braid into thirds and I've laid it out on the floor so you can see the color sections lining up with each other. So this would be if I were to spin each third and then start at the same end and ply from that end. So now I've flipped the orientation of the middle strip, and you can see that now things aren't lining up quite as nicely. However, I'm guessing that when I dyed this, it must have been folded back on itself in the dye pan. And so although things aren't perfectly aligning, you do still see the same general, even though this is coming from the opposite end of the braid, you can see that we still have this model of the yellows and the greens here. We still have our sort of red-brown section lining up. Again, not perfectly aligned, but the greens and yellows lining up against each other. And so this is still going to give me the effect of long color changes if I spin and ply them this way. And you can see at this end, things are really lined up. So this must have been sort of folded on itself so that it dyed in a mirror image down each end of the braid. So now what I've done is I've actually broken the middle strip in half and taken the middle section, moved it to this end. So now you can see that the colors are not aligning so nicely, which will create a more variegated and mottled yarn. And here is the end that was originally done at the bottom, and here's the other end. So that's disrupting sort of the pooling of the colors a little bit further. And finally, to maximize the disruption of the colors, I've gone ahead and flipped this one end to end. So we have sort of the beginning of this end of the braid. So the beginning of the braid, the middle of the braid, and the end of the braid all together here. And that's going to give me the most disruption of the color pooling, which will give me a sock yarn that, rather than having distinct color sections, is more of an optical blend of all of the colors in this fiber. So what I'll do is I'll bundle them up into bumps, roll them up from this end, so that when I go to spin, all of the spinning will start at this end, and then all of the plying will start from that end. I've got my 3 bumps of fiber ready to spin from that braid. I'm just going to grab at random, spin them each onto their own bobbin, and the plan is to 3-ply this. That's all I'm going to do in today's video. I'll check up with you in, say, about 2 weeks, hopefully, with my progress. By then I should have all my singles spun at least, and if not, be ready to ply or have started plying. And if you want to join in on this, I recommend you check out the video below. That's where Andrea shares her plan for this spin and knit along, as well as all the information about it. Or you can hop on over to Ravelry and find all the information in the in her knitting group, where there are tabs for this knit and spin along, and I will link those in the description below. If you're not a Ravelry user, she is also running this along over on Instagram using the hashtag that I don't remember but will magically appear here. And there's already people posting their fiber and their starts for this project there. And you can still participate if you are not a spinner. This along is open to people who just want to knit Andrea Mowry's everyday sock pattern, with encouragement to maybe try out a hand spun yarn that you've purchased or been gifted or acquired through some other means, or a yarn that is spun with colors in such a way that it mimics a hand spun yarn. So that would be something that is dyed in the wool, like a spin cycle yarn. I think that Primrose Yarn Co. has a homestead yarn. I wouldn't quote me on what it's called, but they have a dyed in the wool yarn. There are commercial yarns available that mimic a hand spun look. The Crazy Zobber Balls are one that you can find that will kind of mimic a hand spun look. So there are lots of options. Noro yarns, the Silk Garden sock yarn, will mimic a hand spun sort of dyed in the wool. So that means dyed before the wool was spun into a yarn. So options for people who are not spinners to join in on this as well. But I know just from having peeked in the Ravelry group, there are a lot of first-time spinners who've got spindles or new wheels who are trying this out. So a great chance to join in. Believe it runs through to the end of February. No, probably the end of March, I think. Again, no quoting me. I'm not the source of the information. All that information in the description below. But yeah, join in if you're so inspired to. For me, I'm just excited to have a little bit of drive and mojo to get back on my spinning wheel with a project that is smaller than a sweater spin. That's all for now. I'm so looking forward to this experiment here in my yarn lab, and would be super excited to see what you guys are up to. If you have any questions or just want to share what you're working on, do so in the comments below. I so look forward to hearing from you. Thanks for sticking around with me on this channel where I very intermediately post content. Yeah, looking forward to this.